Okay, I've shared the meeting notes again. Akhil, if you can help me take notes.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. Norman, over to you.
Okay, maybe I'll let Mohan go ahead and share your screen, Mohan, if you can.
Sure.
Mohan will just take us through the context and some of the uh, laying down the foundation, and then maybe we'll take a look at a quick demo, and then we'll go from there.
Okay.
Yeah, let me share screen. So is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah. So hello everyone. So we are going to discuss about Bahmni next, which is probably about our Bahmni EMR frontend. So let's start with some base context. So yeah, the problem statement is now current state of Bahmni. Coming to the current state of Bahmni, the Bahmni has around 164K lines of code, almost in AngularJS, and out of which the majority, 87K lines of code, are part of the critical modules. For example, clinical, operation data, registration, etc. And as we know already, we have around 500 plus implementations of Bahmni across the globe. So the problem summary here is with the Bahmni EMR is Google has announced end of life for AngularJS by this year end, that is by December 2021. So on AngularJS is the framework, front-end framework that Bahmni used for its development of different majority of the features. So the top three risks of having an framework that is getting end of life is these. So the first thing would be over time legacy. The legacy, having a legacy of Bahmni would result in high cost of maintenance. So the a major thing it would be like it would be difficult to find developers who can contribute to Bahmni to support and maintain with an absolute framework. So and then we would not receive any security patches fast enough post this December, because we might have vulnerabilities in that AngularJS framework. And then when a major browser release comes in, then with the specific versions of AngularJS, we may face any issues, or else the packages which AngularJS use and which we use depending on AngularJS might give us some issues, or it may even stop working. So this has already been explained a bit more in this talk thread. And then, yeah, so considering these risks on this point.
Just on the earlier, if you go to the earlier slide, I just wanted to call it out. I mean, these are not like the immediate risks. Like we may not face some of this problem immediately in 2022 for say. We're just talking more from a long-term perspective. That the first one is extremely important. It'll get more harder and harder to find developers for contribution. And even exciting for contributors to extend and scale Bahmni.
Yeah. So considering these risky points, like we thought, why not make Bahmni next framework agnostic? So framework agnostic in the sense means why not make it independent of the framework? So, however, there is no long-term strategy for front-end framework, so that we would not be sure that this could be a long-term framework that would not get an end of life or so. So then, how do we reduce the framework black zone and reduce and support smaller rewrites instead of rewriting Bahmni application as a whole? So that steps would be like, first we would slice the UI into cleanly componentized micro frontends. Maybe we could start with React, and then we would put the components in a custom element. So where we bind the elements and we compose it into a page. And then we would create a layer that would work with an import map, basically, which would stitch all these custom elements together. And that would be purely based on JS and HTML, which could support different frameworks if needed. Yeah.
So I would just take a pause here. I believe maybe Daniel, you had some opinion on this area. Maybe just would like to know your thoughts. I think your opinions were valid, that no matter, even if you rewrite now, there is no guarantee that we will not be rewriting or migrating to yet another framework in future, because the frameworks would keep on getting obsolete. So which is where the intent is, maybe it's no longer about the framework. I think it's a similar pattern of what OpenMRS 3.0 is doing, to kind of break down the problem space and try to eliminate or reduce the blast zone that is created because of existence of the framework, and not really couple to a framework, perhaps.
Yep, that seems right to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
and just one other thing, the initial thoughts that we were having, sorry, if you go to that, the initial thoughts we were having is that while maybe it's not, so the second point, the second bullet is more around maybe how about we wrap things into a web standard? If you're not using a framework, just use something like a web component. Like a year ago or 2 years ago, the standard was not so matured because of the browser compatibility. And it is not going to be a cookie cutter even in 2021, because in order to effectively use a web standard like web components even today, you will still land up in using a framework or a library. And then we're back to the same situation. So I just wanted to call out some thoughts that while it's not as clean of framework agnostic as we would want to, without making or without getting into too much of complexity, by just writing and staying at just pure JavaScript, it's not effective to have all of this at the production grade application and make it simpler for others to also contribute. You can move on.
Yeah. So yeah, but considering these points, in the past week we started to explore the amazing work of OpenMRS micro frontend squad, and here is our initial proposal on how Bahmni Next would look like. So we would leverage the core OpenMRS micro frontend framework, which contains the app shell and the ESM framework, and then we would leverage some of the OpenMRS micro frontend modules, for example, patient management, etc. And then, if needed, we can extend any missing UI components that Bahmni requires, and then even we can add new pages or features, for example, the clinical and the appointment modules, etc. So we have the next goals here. So as we are moving towards a new framework, it's not only like bundling it with a new framework, web framework. Instead, we would like to uplift the user experience of Bahmni as we rewrite.
Getting some disturbance. I don't know, it's just me, or is it your mic, Mohan?
Okay. So is it clear?
I'm also getting quite some disturbance on my end.
Maybe it's just your mic. Can you say something, Mohan?
Yeah, is it fine now?
Yes. Is it fine? Yes, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah. So I would repeat this point again. So as we move on to rewriting of Bahmni, we would not just rewrite it with the latest front-end framework and bundle it together. Instead, we would also work on uplifting the user experience of Bahmni. So, and then next would be, we would cleanly componentize the UI components so that when we face an absoluting front-end framework again, we could incrementally make it out to the newer frameworks. And then we would also reuse OpenMRS micro front-end work as much as possible, and we would not reinvent the square wheel that has been already done. For example, the stitching layer and that we discussed in the previous slides, and also to reduce the duplication for future problems so that we don't fix it at two places. Yeah.
So before we move on, I just wanted to just pinch a little bit there on that earlier slide. So if you look at the third bullet, we would want to reuse the OpenMRS 3.0 front end, maybe different element and aspect of it. And Mohan gave an example of the stitching layer. So if I have to compare this with what we were talking about with web components and wrapping it and making it framework agnostic, the approach that OpenMRS 3.0 front end or micro front end team has done, a squad has done, is to maybe use a framework, single SPA, to do that stitching along with System.js. Now that's yet another framework to solve framework problem. And no matter what you do, like you could try to, the original idea that we had was maybe we could write something like a Webpack who would understand the module federation or import map, which is exactly what single SPA does. Now it's a fair direction to be taken, because the one good thing that has happened with OpenMRS 3.0 is that stitching layer of the application shell is isolated and that's cohesive. So even if in future single SPA drops the ball and maybe something happened to that framework, we can replace the stitching layer without affecting the overall application stack. And that is what we meant by maybe we just reuse some of that so that we don't duplicate the future problems. So instead of Bahmni also creating its own stitching layer, OpenMRS have its own stitching layer, it doesn't make sense. We just try to maybe leverage on what OpenMRS is doing. And then if something goes wrong, we try to fix it at one place.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Okay.
So moving on, Norman, would you like to take about the architecture?
Yeah, I'll maybe share my screen if that's okay, because I'll just go with the architecture and the code at the same time, just to give a high level. So we stop sharing and I'll try to see if I can share my machine. Okay. And let me know once you see my screen. Visible?
Yes, visible.
Okay, cool. So the approach is pretty straightforward and also recommended, I would say, from OpenMRS squad. Everything, the way you read this visual is everything that you see in orange, that's Bahmni Next, or the development that we'll do. Everything in the gray or white, that's OpenMRS 3.0. And then the pink one are the integration that exists with Bahmni today. Okay. So what we're saying is that we would reuse or use the application shell as it is, that have the stitching layer, the parcels, and the system.js, everything. And then we would use this amazing framework that have all the boilerplate required for interacting with fire and rest and state management. We would also want to leverage the style guide and see if there are opportunities to contribute in that as well. There is a great extension system that's already in place that can be used to extend what's there in OpenMRS and also give the capability of extension on top of Bahmni, so that future Bahmni implementation, if there are specific requirement, can be fulfilled. The service worker offline functionality can also be like a bunch of things. The configuration that if you have to change widgets and so on, we would want to maybe just use it as it is instead of just writing our own configuration there. Okay. Now, this would mean that Bahmni would also have its own set of configuration, which compiles the OpenMRS and Bahmni both. There would be import map, which means that the modules that we would want to use from OpenMRS front end and maybe augment on top of it versus just have Bahmni specific functionality that is not present on OpenMRS. And then the translation together, that's managed. And then on the right-hand side that you see is all the front-end modules that will participate into the import map. And that will basically, when we talk about the import map, we're talking about the dynamic dependency where individual front-end module or the UI or the experience is an application on its own that gets rendered on the browser. Okay, so some applications, some front-end application would be out of the box from OpenMRS without changing much beyond configuration. And some modules, something like, for example, patient management, and maybe if there are additional widgets that maybe Bahmni would want to have, either maybe it'll better if you, my opinion is better, maybe we just add it to the patient management itself. But if it's too much of breaking change and maybe very specific for Bahmni, then we can always augment and use the extension and then maybe try to add on top of what's already present. And there would be some dedicated modules that are very specific to Bahmni that we would want to package. Okay, and then this would spit out a front end, and then this is how it works today, where all the integration and different actors interacting to have the entire workflow for maybe, for example, for a given hospital and so on. The idea is that it'll still continue to work with the OpenMRS backend, and even the front end is positioned to work with the backend today. And in the subsequent slide, we'll also see what is our initial idea of maybe how does our first release or increment may look like. I mean, at this point, it's just an idea. And it's open for feedback, but how does that look like with respect to existing Bahmni and Bahmni Next? Existing Bahmni is still on the older version of OpenMRS. So what does it look like? We'll take a look at that too. Okay. Before I switch to just showing a quick demo, very vanilla demo, is there any questions or maybe feedback or challenge that anybody have on this visual or approach?
So one thing around the web components, right? Why not write in plain JavaScript, like, HTML5, etc. Right? That will give you or shield you, for example, for any sort of a framework getting obsolete, right? Now, if you have thought about it and you says like, okay, we are going to go with like, React. Are there some, and can you still go web component route, right? Or is it not possible at all?
If you ask me, it's absolutely possible. Now, there is an RFC and there is a decision record with OpenMRS 3.0 that was written, I believe, way back in 2018. At that time, there were challenges. And in fact, the OpenMRS front-end squad also tried contributing to the polyfills to have the web components being supported in majority of the browser. I think they were back and forth. I believe the OpenMRS squad also had similar love and affection for web components, but it looked like it just turned out to be more complicated back then. I mean, if you ask today, it's a lot of those challenges has been overcome. Most of the major browser supports web component, except for like IE11 and so on. The polyfills are already in place. But in order to use them effectively and reduce a lot of boilerplate, we will land up in using like a pure lit or some sort of library or framework again. That's how I see it. And I don't know what others have opinion on that. Maybe folks who might have contributed on the OpenMRS front end.
So Daniel, have you guys evaluated
I have a couple
that option?
questions, if that's okay.
Sorry, Grace, go ahead.
Yes, please.
No, it's fine. I didn't have much to say about that. So over to Daniel.
I'm sure you had a question.
Yeah, so I'm saying like, probably as Norman said, like, 3-4 years down the line, things would have been probably different, right? Now things have moved on from there. Have you reevaluated in terms of using just pure web component standards?
No, we have not done that. It's been a while since we evaluated that. So I agree, things may have changed as of today.
Okay.
Yes, we could reach out to Brandon. I can follow up with him if you'd like, because I think that he's been asking some questions about that recently, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think it'll be good to maybe just poke holes a little bit in that subject. I know I shouldn't say I know, but to my limited knowledge, it's absolutely possible, and there are a lot of production application, at least to my knowledge, that are running today with respect to just using web components. But then that would also mean that by just using web component doesn't come out of the box with respect to stitching layer, right? We still have to build a stitching layer. We still have to wrap it. So one strategy could be that maybe, hey, maybe the finest grain components that we would want to write, or it could be just the atomic components on the page, like a button or a text box or some small experience that could be in web components. And then that's pretty much abstracted, and nobody can just spy into it. And we kind of create that entire style system. But then we still have to use it somewhere, right? We still have to, either we would land up in using in React, or we try to compile it into an HTML, which will be too much of code to kind of effectively compile it. And then the moment we land up in using state and passing state along into the web components, we're basically looking at just passing on strings as the props. And that's not very, I mean, that's not enough for an application. And then we'll keep on adding maybe some sort of framework on top of it to ensure that maybe every time we pass on props and we want components to talk, then we maintain the state in an appropriate way, because what web component supports is the custom events. That's one part of the equation, and that's a lot of code that needs to be rewritten, at least from a OpenMRS 3.0 perspective. The other part of the equation is that React and web components, at least even now, do not go very well hand in hand. So that's another challenge that we'll have to invest in. I'm glad that I have this website open on my screen. If you see my screen, there's this custom element everywhere, like the huge JavaScript community who is really passionate about just keeping everything JavaScript. And they've done a bunch of tests around how the frameworks actually work with custom elements and web components. Most of the libraries are doing well, except for React, where the score is coming down to 71%. For basic integration, it's fine. But for maybe advanced stuff, like for example, an event created or side effect created into a web component is not understood by maybe a React component, which is wrapping the web component and vice versa. And you will have to maybe hack a lot of things here and there to make React and web component work together. For other frameworks, it's fine, but not between React and web component. But I do agree that maybe it's good to maybe poke holes a little bit more in that area and see what maybe the squad, the OpenMRS front-end squad have to say, at least sitting in 2021.
Okay. A few other related questions is this. See, it's not just about selecting something that is absolute pure, right? Web components probably may be standard, but also you need to see the supporting ecosystem around it, right? Right now, React is in vogue, for example, and looking at say Bahmni, communities, most of the people, for example, are not long timers, right? They would come, participate, and then probably move on. And one of the aspect of such contributors whom we would absolutely like to leverage is this, that it also is beneficial for them for their career perspective, right? Now, is there some tension? Is the web components ecosystem well developed? Will it does it take substantial learning time? Say for example, if you can go to YouTube, you see a video on there are bunch of tutorials on React, and you can get going. How is the support system around web components?
In my opinion, and I'll let others also talk, there is a lot of excitement in the front-end community is what I see it. Now, there is a lot of bashing back and forth. It's like people are saying that, hey, why are you guys even spending time in making web components mature? Because all of this problem has been solved by frameworks already. But this community still wants to explore this to keep it pure. So I would say it's evolving, which is why in last 1 year, the web components have become very much matured. And the browser compatibility and support has also showed up for sure. But yeah, I would say it's an evolving state at the moment. I did had a chance to talk to a few teams at least in my connection who has done web component and production grade application. So web components are also not free lunch. Like it does have its own challenging because of maybe compatibility with some working with React and working with the limitation, because if developers are used to working with a framework like React, and that comes with a lot of abstraction and does the entire lifecycle management for you. And the moment you start working on web components, you don't get everything as free and you start writing a lot of code and exploring it. So in order to make it mature and creating framework by yourself as compared to something that React gives you out of the box is tricky. But I think once you get the handle of it, it turns out to be your asset that you can understand and manage as compared to keeping it as completely black box. I don't know what others having experience with web components who have been exploring in past. Anybody?
I agree. Like, I mean, I am a big fan of pure JavaScript. I learned JavaScript not on the browser, but actually like, developing backend things way back in 96, working on Netscape. And lots of people might not know that your television remotes runs on JavaScript. Your modern TVs runs of JavaScript. Your tons of IoT devices like, have got embedded JavaScript running. So I'm a big fan of JavaScript, and I would love to have like, things written on JavaScript, and it's based on standard, right? But it's not for me, it's for the ecosystem, and we must think about like, how I can quickly enable the community to be useful, to contribute like, in quick time. And that's why the support system is relevant. And I totally agree that with you that, irrespective of whatever, even if you use pure JavaScript, I mean, you could do that. I mean, Bahmni could do that, like, required JS was there. I mean, right now, if you look into this, there is system JS and required JS, but the ball was set by required JS way back in 2011, 2012. And actually, lots of people felt that like, it will slow down in terms of creating lots of this stitching layer infrastructure components is going to take a lot of time. So we cannot ignore those things at all. Otherwise, like, we'll be taking forever. So I like the fact that piggybacking on the OpenMRS 3.0, and in a way, like, we have shared the risk, right? It's not just like, Bahmni as such, but React being 70%, right, compliant, does it make sense for us to use React? Should we use something like, say, Angular, I don't know, latest version 7 or something of this sort, or Vue? I don't know where's Vue.js's compatibility. Another big question for me is this. These are still bundled as ESM modules. I am guessing that whatever the transformation or the compilation will from, say, Vue or AngularJS will generate pure web component standard libraries that can be loaded by the microfrontend 3.0. Is it a fair thing to, or is not evaluated yet?
I can say two things here. When you called out two things, at least, one is, I'll go to the first part of what you were saying, Anshuman, on the JavaScript or pure JavaScript is being running on the IoT devices and so on. There are different reasons, at least in my opinion, for using web components. Like the teams that I talk to that are using web components in production, and they were smaller squads that were working on a bigger application, and there was one squad who was just working on reusable component or style guide along with the components. And those components were written into web components, and there were other application squads that, or feature squads that, who were consuming those web components. And these squads were using frameworks of their choice. I mean, that's how most of the applications are just making a zoo of different frameworks and from where they're coming from, and they just want to use whichever framework they would like to use. So some were on React, some were on Vue, some were on AngularJS, and all three of them were using web components for compiling their own application. That was one use case of web components where you can just use it anywhere, and that's not framework dependent. Another use case that you also called out is like SpaceX, NASA. They build their entire their dashboard in web components, and one of the reasoning for web components is that the bundle size is into bytes. Like it's not into KB, it's just in bytes. That's so tiny, and it's very fast. And they have limited memory. In that case, it's fine to take the pain of the boilerplate code and additional stitching layer that you may have to write and support it. And in response, in return, you get maybe the performance and the size and so on and so forth. For us, when we were poking into this, the reason for considering web components was mostly to make it framework agnostic. So even if we choose to use React, the original idea was not to write in web components purely, but rather maybe use a framework, which is maybe hot in the market at the moment, but try to wrap it and then create a stitching layer using web components and so on, so that you can, under the hood, refactor your components from one library or framework to another without affecting the overall application, which to some extent single SPA is actually doing, and so on. That was the first part. I actually forgot the second part of the question. I'm sorry. What
I
did
said,
you?
like, if React is only 70% compliant,
70%. Yes, you're right. Yes.
is it like,
So-
advisable to use Angular or something else?
So when we were doing, when I say when we were like myself, Mohan and Abhi, when we were just exploring what's the option of web components, we did a quick spike. I don't have the workspace ready. I would have shown you. The 71% is out of the box. Now there are tons of open source and libraries already created to have React effectively work with web components and vice versa. In fact, we also wrote our own. We also wrote our own higher order function that will take care of not just passing on props as string, but we were also able to pass on functions, just like how you would pass functions as props to React. And we were successful. But we were able to use custom events and hack a little bit here and there to create a wrapper so that we can effectively use. So it would be a matter of time, Anshuman, is how I see it. I don't think so that 71% is a decision point. Maybe in next 1 year, either React evolves or there are enough library just to support the integration well enough, is how I see it.
Okay. I don't understand this, like, you emphasized but multiple times this custom events. I mean, you could create your custom events for donkey's years. What's so special about it?
Sorry, come again. Can you ask a question again?
I'm wondering, like, because to be able to react to a custom event types was there, like,
Yes, it is
for
there,
many years.
which is
right?
why,
Like,
yeah.
it's not new.
It is not new, but the way React has chosen to attend to the side effect is it creates its own virtual DOM and creates synthetic events. It doesn't respond to custom events. And web component
but that's a React problem, right? I'm saying, like, but I'm saying, like, if you use something like a view, for example, would you have that problem?
No, I don't think so. Which is why the site actually says that the compatibility is okay. It's fine with other frameworks. It's because of the React, and it's specifically around the synthetic events that React have a brain of its own. It creates a virtual DOM and tries to understand the side effect and then tries to render it back. That's what it does. And when you have in your entire DOM, if you have web components who is creating custom events, React is not going to understand that. Neither the React component creating events, side effects, will be understood by the web components. See, the only channel for them to talk is through the custom events, which React doesn't understand, which is why you create wrappers, which is what I was referring to kind of pass it on to the props and manually create side effect in React.
Okay. So in the end, what do you suggest, right? Like, we still use React, or do you use, like, Vue, or are you saying, like, let's use React, but, like, let's do the stitching ourselves. Let's do all the, like, plugging the gaps ourselves.
See, the suggestion is that we continue to, we start making some progress here. We continue to maybe use React and also being consistent with what OpenMRS is doing. Because there is also the fact that we don't want to start using multiple frameworks for one application stack. And then we progress. The stitching layer is already in place that OpenMRS is already implemented. So let's use it. Let's reuse it, learn about it, and start building components. Because even at the moment, if you were to not use React and start using web components, I don't think so we can compile an entire experience. Like, for example, clinical module, just in web components. We will land up in using a framework. the intention of calling web components originally was to make it framework agnostic specifically for stitching. And now the fact that the stitching layer is already in place, then maybe it doesn't matter much at the moment, if in my opinion. We can continue in the React. And if there is an issue with React in future, it's a big issue for OpenMRS too. And then we have to have a plan of action then. And in that state, we're not trying to rewrite the whole application as a back then. It would be like component by component, because these are individual application anyways, and then maybe either we migrate to a higher version of React, or maybe move out of React, or God knows what framework it would be then.
Only thing is that, like, if we go too far down the line, and one of the things is also that I've seen is this: people just go in terms of so micro level in terms of componentization, right? It just becomes an Herculean effort, for example, to go back and refactor, or like, reintroduce some things. It's just like becomes an Herculean task. Do you see that risk? Or do you think like, no, it's okay? I mean, most of the changes would be in the app shell.
Yeah, so if you're able to cleanly, so there are a couple of things here. One is all of the framework and reusable or boilerplate interaction with the OpenMRS backend, or be it state management, or be it configuration extension system. It's wrapped into this framework, and this framework is just not one. It's bundled as one library, but internally it has multiple projects. That's one piece. The second is the app shell is another piece, which have the CLI of OpenMRS, the system.js, and the single SPA being bundled together. So that's one, which we are not touching. That's something that the squad has done a good job of just bifurcating and drawing the boundary. Now, when it comes to drawing the boundary for the front end, I think that's something that we'll have to put in some guardrails, because you can call a small widget also as a front end module, or you can call the entire clinical dashboard or feature as the module. We'll have to define as we go along to what is the boundary that we have to create. When we say cleanly componentize, what is that physical separation that we would want to create so that our future refactor is easier, and what is that abstraction that we want to put in place?
Okay.
I'm guessing that would be a problem that would have also been discussed, right, when OpenMRS development has been happening, because there are a lot of various components already and experiences, and whether you break it into a calendar, or you break it into a date, or you break it into a month, or you break it into an appointment control, I think, like, I have a feeling like there is going to be already some overlaps, even architecturally and philosophically there already.
Yes. I was watching some of the videos from OpenMRS from Florin, and while you see this is the core, and that packages a lot of smaller projects together, which is great. But if you look at some of the other, let me go to repository, and let's see, patient. And if I look at the patient management, it is packaging these three applications together: just patient search, registration, and listing of patient when you search them. Now, this was supposed to be a monorepo. I'm not sure why there is a decision that was made to have a patient management, and choice was made to bundle only these three apps. I heard Florence saying that somewhere they need to refactor how they are organizing the monorepo itself. Like another example could be, I don't know why it is called as patient chart, or I don't know if it is patient chart, or yes, this one, this patient chart. Now this patient chart have a bunch of projects, packages, a lot of them, which includes form entry and everything that you see in the patient summary and clinical. Again, not very clear of what was the choice to package them together and call it patient chart. But there are it looks like there is some work on OpenMRS side to kind of make it consistent. But the grain of creating the application is there. Some of them are widgets, some of them are pages, and so on. Like there are some of the components are very fine grain, some of them are like coarse grain and bigger, and so on. We will land up into the same situation ourselves too, to define that boundary of what do we call an app, and that would be dictated, in my opinion, through what do we want to abstract, or if something is related, it makes sense to put them together. And one thing we have to stay away from, and in my opinion, when it comes to micro frontend, the moment we see that, hey, one app really needs to pass data to another app, that's a clear feedback that maybe they're not two different apps, that they should be living together on the same page. So maybe some of those indications will have to take some feedback and try to package them together.
Okay, I mean, yeah, definitely we need to have a discussion. This is probably like next level of problems
Correct.
to solve, right? Okay.
Yes. I'm just looking at the time as well. I'll quickly go. Are there any questions, or should I proceed? I just want to quickly show a quick demo of what does it look like.
In the interest of time, I think the demo, let's just go
Okay.
through the demo and then we can take questions after that.
Sounds good. I do have a repository. This repository is bootstrapped using OpenMRS CLI. Okay. Now this repository is a monorepo. It uses Yarn workspace. And with the workspace right now, it's just packaging, for example, just two Bahmni specific application. And just for the sake of demo, these are all hypothetical. These application doesn't mean anything, and it's all crap at the moment. But just to demonstrate the concept on how it is actually using the shell, and on top of that, how we are able to maybe create a page and so on. Okay, now it uses OpenMRS CLI, and the moment you get into OpenMRS CLI develop, it kind of uses most of the stuff from the demo or sandbox environment of OpenMRS with the default import map, which includes most of the thing that had been packaged for the ref app, I believe so. And then you can tweak a couple of environmental variables, like you can set your URL to whatever you want. By default, it is OpenMRS/SPA. And then you can indicate what sources you want to really render. So right now I'm just adding everything that's present in the packages here. And these two applications are very straightforward. One, the search app, if you see, if I go to index, it basically have a route on search, is basically Bahmni specific search. And then it also have a top navigation action slot that takes an action basically to, when you click on that navigation icon, it takes you to Bahmni search. And it's a simple code. When you click, it navigates to search route. And here, the search route, you render the search component, which is this. And it's a very basic component. It have an input field, the button, title, and so on. We'll talk about the extension slot later. Let me go ahead and say Yarn Bahmni. And Bahmni is just a script name that I've given. I don't want to use Chrome. Let me go to Firefox and just load it here. Now, since I'm in the development mode, you can see how it's actually loading everything from the OpenMRS sandbox. It's just pointing to the sandbox and just loading all of the application at the moment. And when the download is done, it takes a while. And let me press, it just takes a couple of enters before it gets loaded. Okay, admin. And all of this login, everything is customizable with respect to logo and stuff. You can change that. And it comes to the home page. Okay. Now this is the default home page, which you will find on the OpenMRS SPA homepage too. And I'm just going to go to OpenMRS SPA, which is running that the ref app is running there. And it kind of loads the similar. Of course, after it takes its own time. let me click on home. And it loads the patient visit here. Okay. Now, one difference that you'll see is there is a widget here for Bahmni that has been injected, and the way it has been injected very clearly is you have this Bahmni patient visit app, and it's a very simple widget that says that, hey, just add this widget onto the homepage slot. That's part of the extension system, and we're basically just adding this widget, which have a very basic code that uses the carbon modal and a text area where I click on this, it just uses carbon modal. It just creates a dummy model with some crappy values. Okay. The other part that I was talking about is this injection of maybe another extension on the header slot, where I click on that and it takes me to my to our own Bahmni search. Now, there's no reason to write Bahmni search, just for the demonstration purpose. I can click on search, I can get values, connect to OpenMRS backend, and have its own look and feel. Okay. That is pretty much it, just to demonstrate that, which is, of course, that was possible of what OpenMRS 3.0 has done. There is one more thing I would like to say is that, for example, like if we package Bahmni and with this approach, we could give additional extension slot. So, for example, we say that, hey, the search result, maybe future implementation of Bahmni may require specific widgets on the search result. So what do we do? So maybe we just give them extension slot, and the implementers can add any number of widgets to that specific page if they can target to this key. And I'll just quickly show you what does that mean. So I stop this, and I do have, let me stop this. So I do have another, say, library, another branch, say Save the Child. So let's say the implementer is working for Save the Child Trust and implementing Bahmni for them. And the Save the Child Trust wants to have a widget called as maybe child happiness widget. And this child happiness widget, they want to just render it maybe on the search result page. Okay, and it just shows you something like buttons and slider, and the child is happy and whatnot. Okay, and if I go ahead and maybe, I don't know why it is giving problems here. Yes. Oh, okay. So right now, if I run this yarn Bahmni, let me just run this. Right now, it's just a definition. I don't want to use this. It's just a definition of the extension. It doesn't tell that, hey, I'm rendering on this search. Okay. So if I go back to my search app, and when it loads, I should not see this widget, right? It's the same thing that we saw, right? So what we'll do is that we'll just go to our search, and then in the search, the extension slot name that we have given is this slot, okay? And then we'll say that, hey, let's render the slot, or render this extension onto this slot. And I'll go ahead and save this. Okay. And when I render this, I get this widget being rendered here, which then we can just play with it. Yeah, I just wanted to demonstrate the concept that, well, while the extension system can be used, OpenMRS extension system can be used to extend and implement Bahmni, but we can also make Bahmni flexible to allow future implementation of Bahmni to extend it further on top of the new pages and widgets that we develop for Bahmni itself. From a demo perspective, that is it that I had. Any questions, or this was very straightforward?
No, clear enough.
Okay.
I don't know if others, like anybody has any question. Akhil, Avina, Gurpreet, David.
So maybe I just wanted to make sure that the summary of what we've discussed today, like as a takeaways is clearer, so that what I'm thinking and what everyone else here, Numan, is saying is the same, right, at a high level. I think at a high level, what I'm understanding is that we want to leverage the OpenMRS 3.0 MF framework we want to explore and start working further to see now, like we've already done some, small POCs to understand the framework, what is possible, how is it packaged, what is the underlying tech stack, and how can we like write, extensions that can like fit into slots, yet keep our components separate in separate repositories. And I think moving forward, I feel like the next step really is to say that, okay, let's assume for the time being that the new UI for Bahmni will be written using OpenMF or OpenMRS 3.0 MF. What are the improvements, and how will we go about doing that? And then come back again, say after a week or a little more, depending on how the team feels comfortable, and say that, okay, this is what I think our strategy now will look like, which is more concrete, and what are some of the potential things in the current implementation of OpenMRS 3.0 that, if any, we may want to improve, so that this new code and refactoring to some degree, kind of the whole thing looks good, and get feedback again from the community on whether that seems to be a sensible way to move forward, so that both OpenMRS and Bahmni communities are able to kind of leverage the work done by each other, and find like this common way to continue to keep moving forward from the front end perspective. Is this like a fair, maybe overly simplified summary?
And a broad level, I think, okay. I think one of the next steps that you talked about is maybe catch up with Brandon and Florian to really think about, like, what have they evaluated, for example, web components, right? Is there, like, a possibility of, like, supporting as a first class concept in OpenMRS? And I would like to have you guys, like, have a discussion around it. So we go at least with information that, like, or some sort of an understanding, mutual understanding.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good, in my opinion, it'll be a good conversation to have. One thing that we kind of debated in a smaller, when we were just poking holes here and there, the intent of web components, I think I may be, sorry, I may be repeating myself, but the intent of the web component originally was for the stitching layer. And the reason why there was a little bit of back off is in the presence of the app shell, if we were to introduce web components, we're basically challenging the app shell. Instead of using single SPA, replace it with web component style. And that will take some good amount of effort now to do so. That was one way of thinking. And if you were to go that route, we are also saying that we would wrap our components, like something like React, the front-end modules that we write in React or whichever technology stack, into web components. So we create a wrapper of web components and make it web standard, and then we stitch them together. So I believe that will be a good conversation to have. What does that look like if you were to do it now? Or if you were to do that in future as well, we still have a win-win situation, because we would have the components and front-end module with us. It would be a matter of wrapping it and rewriting the stitching layer. So the question is, when do we do it? Now, or we let the web components be more mature? But that'd be, I mean, that's the exact conversation to have, and hear some of the, I would like to hear some of the opinion from the team as well, the squad. What do they feel? Because I believe some of them have also contributed to single SPA as well as to polyfills of web components.
You might be referring to Joel, but Joel isn't involved actually.
Oh, okay. Joel is no longer involved into this. Okay. Okay.
So does web component support dynamic loading like, say, System.js?
So web components, as long as you write your code into web components, it needs to be resolvable through a CDN or to a reference, and you inject it through a script tag, like pure HTML we are talking about here. See, web components do not have any brain whatsoever. It's a pure JS it have a couple of boilerplate callback function to manage the life cycle of the component when it attaches to the DOM and when it gets removed from the DOM, and that's about it. Apart from that, that's everything is just JavaScript. So you can imagine that if you were to maybe add some maturity and reduce boilerplate, we would land up in using something like the lit element, so pure lit, to make it more effective in order to compile at least a smaller user experience.
Yeah, because I do not want to underestimate, like, the memory footprint, right? Bahmni, for example, you would have seen there is a fair bit of memory footprint, right?
Okay.
And essentially, like, if you see the Chromebooks or other mobile devices, like, being cheaper and being widely, like, available and stable, most of the time, like, the users only deal with this. They do not need the full computing power or the add-ons at all. A browser, many cases, is just sufficient, at least in our ecosystem. And so memory footprint is an important aspect. And like, honestly, one of my problem, and if you look into the Bahmni's use case scenarios, hey, somebody who is at the registration is never going to use clinical module, or like, very rarely, right? Somebody is at the IPD, will be at the IPD, no need for to go into something else, right? And that's how it is designed from the user's perspective, not like, as a, oh, okay, we need to solve the, like, technology problem of loading everything, having, like, everything dynamic. These are all, like, technical aspects of it, right?
Yeah.
But I want you guys to be conscious of that from the usage perspective, and make it as nimble and as lightweight as possible as well.
Yeah, there's maybe from the micro front end, there is one basic fundamental that is must have, is to ensure that we don't land up in loading the same dependency across all the micro front end. And I believe some of that work has already been incorporated with the OpenMRS 3.0, where you see the peer dependency. We won't be loading React and the I18 Next and everything with every micro front end, even though every micro front end does use it. So we load the dependency once. And then every smaller front-end module will just load the respective dependencies, what they need. That's one part of the equation. The second is that I suspect that, and I've not validated and tested it enough, is this whole get async lifecycle does the good job of lazy loading and ensures that if you are only using registration module, you don't incur the cost of loading the rest of the world for Bahmni. So you only, so that's something that we have to watch. And if there's, maybe there is an opportunity for contribution, maybe we can add there. By just reading the function, the higher order function that has been called out here, I believe the imports is similar to the lazy loading approach of React that is being used. I've not gotten into much detail here. Okay, we are 4 minutes over. I don't know, Anshu, we had one last slide. Is it fair or we take it up in the next call?
I'll ask others. Are you guys okay to take, like, 1 or 2 minutes?
Yes, okay with me. The meeting is being recorded, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's okay with me.
Okay, Abhi, I'm sharing my screen. You can just take this one.
Yes, so once we are done with a module or a module or a small lesser widget, we are planning to release it incrementally. So considering the Bahmni users should have a seamless experience. So for example, if we say a registration module is done, we are only that module will communicate to the OpenMRS 3.x, and rest of the other features will be communicating to the current OpenMRS 2.x. And we have to spike this out because if we are going with this approach, both the backend should communicate to the same database. So at that point, we have to spike how lock and key or how that happens. And the second option would be we'll upgrade the backend completely to the newest 3.x, and we'll fix the breaking changes, and then both the older version and the new version will communicate to the same backend.
Why should be a challenge? It should be possible to call any APIs that you want. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, we were just poking holes, and this was just a desperate opinion at the moment. We haven't given enough thought. So what has been what Abhi is trying to say is that if you were to implement registration, for example, we use as it is OpenMRS 3.0 and add maybe here and there nibbles, and we want to release it. How does the seamless experience for the end user for Bahmni looks like?
Oh, that will not work. That will not work. We'll have to look deeper onto this because the Bahmni's registration, for example, I think as you would have seen, and there is a market difference in terms of like, and as I said, in the use cases scenarios.
Correct.
Right? Bahmni
Correct.
is used as a point of care systems in smaller hospitals to bigger hospitals, for example, right? And there is a more or less like, general pattern of usages over there, right? People tend to use like, desktops with keyboards. So it must be keyboard friendly. It cannot be multiple pages. There are concepts about like, dynamic attributes, no coding that is required. There is a fair amount of things that needs to be done. So I don't think like, we can just take the OpenMRS registration.
Yeah, that was just an example. So imagine that maybe we write registration from scratch. Okay. We package it into Bahmni Next. This is just a deployment release strategy that we would have two Bahmni running for the same user. And when the user has to go to the registration, that will be navigated to Bahmni Next. Now, when that happens, Bahmni Next would be talking to OpenMRS 3.x. That's option number one. Whereas when the user goes to other module like clinical, it would be talking to the old OpenMRS. Is there a possibility to use the same database across two OpenMRS instances between 2.x and 3.x? Unless there is a breaking changes on the schema, it's not possible. So that's something that we want to spike it out just to ensure that we can release it without upgrading old Bahmni on 3.x. The second approach,
it should be possible, right? Because there is an like, OpenMRS, like, what ESM OMOD, for example, which is fairly simple. You can actually, if I believe, you can also deploy it using like an Apache or Nginx or something, because all it is doing is basically minimally getting the import maps and other things, like if I remember.
Okay.
So I don't think that will be a bigger thing. But for example, if you're using a component that is using new APIs that are not there in the version of OpenMRS core that we are using, those will have to look into that.
Yeah. Like for example, the OpenMRS 3.0 uses like Fire 2 as compared to the old ones, which means we still be responded. So we can
Fire
configure...
2 is fine. Fire 2 we can drop in a Bahmni. It works perfectly fine. So that is not a problem. Yeah. But Fire 2 APIs right now is nowhere like, near like, satisfactory for Bahmni's like, needs. And it is also like, very chatty. If you see, it's like a sort of like, very cruddish, and which is also other things that we probably need to discuss. But anyway, remember there is another thing that we would be trying out is upgrade the OpenMRS core itself to 2.4. Right now we are on 2.1. So hopefully, like, you will not have soon enough API incompatibility issues, but that should not be a absolute bottleneck for you guys. My first impression.
Yeah, sure. I think we can actually take this up when we have a chance to maybe get deeper into this area. I think we just called it out because possible. Maybe we upgrade to 3.x. We were thinking that we would take Bahmni, the old Bahmni, to 3.x, but what I'm hearing you say is that maybe not everything on 3.x is to that level, which will work well with old Bahmni.
Not everything of OpenMRS 3.x APIs is sufficient for Bahmni's needs. Let me put the other way around.
Okay.
Right. The Fire APIs are really, really basic, for example.
Okay.
And it would not be sufficient.
Okay.
And I think like the, OpenMRS 3.0, for example, allows you to call other APIs, any APIs. It doesn't need to be Fire always. So I don't think like, we need to be, yes, we want to be Fire first, but if like, it is not there, we don't need to be necessarily be stuck.
Fair. Okay, I'll stop sharing. That was it from our side.
Cool. I think this has been a super session. Thank you so much. So what is the, next step? I think I'm very keen to hear, like, from Brandon and Florian in terms of their, like, having you guys discuss this. Can you guys do this, like, before the next PAT call? Is it possible?
Yes, I
Remember,
would
this
like
is
to do
a-
that. Yeah.
Yeah, remember, this is, I think, like, the Thanksgiving grace, if I'm not wrong. So many people might be off.
Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Is there a way to reach out? Grace, would you help to connect us
I
to?
would so love to.
Okay, awesome.
That would be great.
But
Yeah, I'll
many
reach
people might
out,
be off, no? Grace?
Yeah, they might be off today or tomorrow, but we can certainly set something up like ASAP. Next week is actually the OpenMRS conference, so even if we just set it up as an unconferencing session, maybe that would work too. But regardless, what I'll do is I'll start an email connection like ASAP here. It's also, this call is also at 5 a.m. for Brandon in his time zone, so that also plays a role.
Right. Cool. Okay. Grace, will lean on to you to set this up.
Sounds awesome. I will reach out right away.
Yeah. All right. This has been a super session. Thanks, like, Avi, Mohan. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks,
folks.
Grace, for dropping by.
My pleasure. This is very exciting.
Yes, we all are. Hopefully, we can move together on this. So thanks, everybody. We'll meet next week again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, folks. Thanks, team.